Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time we're diving into something that's a little bit heavy, but incredibly important for all of you safety and risk management pros out there. OSHA's procedures for imminent danger, fatalities, catastrophes, and emergency response. And to help us navigate these complex waters, we have a true expert in the field. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so our source material today is OSHA's Field Operations Manual, Chapter 11. This is kind of the playbook for these critical situations. And, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, let's start with a fundamental question. What exactly does OSHA consider imminent danger?
Well, the manual defines it as any conditions or practices in any place of employment, which are such that a danger exists which could reasonably be expected to cause death, or serious physical harm immediately or before the imminence of such danger can be eliminated through the enforcement procedure.
Okay, wow, that's a mouthful. So it's not just like a potential hazard. It's got to be something that could cause serious harm, like right now.
Right, there has to be a very real threat of death or serious injury, and a high probability that it could happen immediately before you'd normally have time to fix it.
So this applies to both safety hazards like a collapsing structure and health hazards too, right?
Yeah.
Like exposure to a dangerous chemical.
Absolutely. So for a health hazard to be considered imminent danger, that exposure has to be severe enough that it could potentially shorten someone's life or cause an immediate threat to their health. Think along the lines of what's called IDLH, immediately dangerous to life and health.
Got it. So it's not just like walking past a freshly painted wall. It's got to be serious stuff.
Okay.
So let's say OSHA gets a report about imminent danger. What happens next? Do they show up with sirens blaring?
Well, not quite, but they do move quickly. The manual really emphasizes that time is of the essence in these situations. Ideally, an inspection should be conducted the same day the report comes in, and no later than the next day.
Okay, so they're not messing around. Every minute counts when people's lives are at stake. But I'm guessing there are times when they just can't get an inspector on site that quickly, right?
Of course, especially if the report comes in late in the day or the location is remote.
So what happens then?
Well, in those cases, they'll immediately contact the employer, gather all the details about the situation, and really urge them to remove employees from the danger zone voluntarily.
So even if they can't be there right away, they're still taking action to protect workers. That makes sense.
And it's important to note that the employer needs to document every step they take to address the danger. Having those clear records is really crucial in these situations.
Okay, makes sense. Now, this next part kind of surprised me when I first read it. The manual mentions something called advance notice for imminent danger situations. So does that mean OSHA might actually warn an employer that they're coming?
Yeah, they might. But it's not about giving the employer a free pass or a chance to cover things up. Remember, the goal is always to eliminate the hazard as quickly as possible, and sometimes a heads up can actually speed things up, especially when an immediate inspection just isn't possible.
Interesting. So it's more of a strategic move than a courtesy call.
Exactly. And they don't just notify the employer either. They also give the advance notice to the authorized employee representative, and in some cases, even the person who reported the danger, as long as doing so won't delay fixing the problem.
Okay, so it's about transparency and making sure everyone's in the loop.
Right.
And working towards the same goal, resolving the danger as quickly as possible. So when the OSHA inspector does arrive, the focus is on collaboration.
Right.
They want to work with both the employer and employee representatives to assess the situation and make things safe.
Exactly.
So it's less like an adversarial gotcha situation, more like a team effort to get things right.
That's the idea.
So during the inspection, the employer will be formally notified about the imminent danger and asked to take action. And this includes notifying affected employees, removing them from exposure, and most importantly, taking steps to fix the problem.
Right.
Now, you said voluntary steps. That makes me think OSHA prefers it if employers handle the issue themselves.
Absolutely.
They'd much rather see voluntary action than have to force it.
Yeah. In fact, the manual actually highlights 3 key components of successful voluntary hazard elimination.
Oh, okay. So this sounds like valuable information for our listeners. What are those 3 components?
Well, first, the employer has to immediately remove all affected employees from the danger zone. No questions asked, no exceptions, get those people out of harm's way.
Okay, makes sense. Safety first, always. What's next?
The second component is addressing the root cause of the problem. The employer needs to either remove that hazardous condition completely or abate it, meaning reduce the risk as much as possible.
So if there's a risk of a roof collapse, you either shore up that roof immediately or get everyone out from under it.
Exactly. And the third component is all about demonstrating that this isn't just a temporary fix. They need to provide what the manual calls satisfactory assurance to OSHA that the hazard won't come back once employees are allowed back into the area.
Okay. Satisfactory assurance. That sounds a little vague. Does the manual give any specific examples of what that might look like?
It does. It lays out a few different ways an employer can demonstrate their commitment to a safe environment. For example, they could take immediate corrective action that permanently eliminates the hazard, like a complete repair or replacement of faulty equipment.
Okay, yeah. That definitely shows you're serious about safety. What are some other options?
Another way is to show a good faith effort towards a permanent fix, while restricting all access to the hazardous area until that fix is in place. So even if they can't solve it immediately, they're actively working on it and keeping everyone away from the danger in the meantime.
Okay. But what if a permanent fix just isn't feasible right away?
There's an option for that too. They can implement temporary measures like requiring PTE while they're working towards that permanent solution. But here's the catch. They have to strictly enforce the use of that PPE. No cutting corners.
So it's about layering those safety measures, doing everything you can to protect workers while working towards that lasting solution.
Absolutely.
But even if an employer says they've abated the imminent danger, OSHA doesn't just take their word for it, right?
Right. The inspectors are going to be there on site, observing and verifying that the actions taken are truly effective.
Okay, so there are checks and balances. It's about accountability. But let's say an employer either refuses to eliminate the danger or just can't do it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
What happens then? Does OSHA have the power to just shut everything down?
Well, that's actually a common misconception. OSHA can't order a worksite closure or force employees to evacuate. They can strongly encourage it. But ultimately, the final decision rests with the employer.
Interesting. So even in these extreme cases, there are limits to OSHA's authority. But it's clear they have options, right? They can encourage voluntary action, but they can also pursue legal action if necessary. So what are those legal options?
Well, if voluntary action fails, the first step is usually posting a notice of an alleged imminent danger. This is a pretty serious step, and the inspector will consult with their area director before doing so.
Okay, so there's a process in place.
Right.
What happens next?
Well, if the situation requires further action, the area director, after consulting with the regional administrator, and potentially even the regional solicitor's office, might seek what's called a temporary restraining order, or TRO from a U.S. district court. That's basically a legal way to try to force the employer to fix the problem.
Wow. Okay, so things can escalate pretty quickly.
They can.
And it can even involve the courts if needed.
Yeah.
But what about the employees themselves? Are they kept in the loop during all of this?
Absolutely. Both affected employees and their representatives are notified about the posted notice and informed about their rights under Section 11C of the OSH Act.
Okay, and what does that include?
Well, this includes the right to refuse work if they believe they're in imminent danger.
That's important. They have the right to protect themselves. Well, this has been a pretty deep dive into imminent danger, and we've got a lot more to cover: fatalities, catastrophes, and emergency response. But I think it's a good time to take a quick breather, let all this information sink in. We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration of these critical OSHA procedures.
Sounds good.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about imminent danger, those situations where a hazard could cause serious harm, like right away. But what happens when, well, the worst case scenario actually occurs? What are OSHA's procedures for handling fatalities and catastrophes?
Well, that's where things get even more serious, obviously. And it's important to understand what exactly OSHA considers a fatality and a catastrophe. They have very specific definitions for those terms.
Right, because a fatality, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Someone dies as a result of a workplace incident.
Right, exactly. It's the death of an employee resulting from a work-related incident or exposure.
Okay, but catastrophe, that's a little bit broader, right?
Yeah, it is. OSHA defines a catastrophe as an incident that results in the hospitalization of 3 or more employees because of a work-related incident.
Okay.
And they also specified that hospitalization means the person was formally admitted to the hospital for care and treatment, not just for observation or testing.
So it's really about the severity of the injuries, not just the number of people involved.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So like 3 employees getting minor cuts that require a quick trip to the ER.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be a catastrophe.
No, not necessarily. The injuries need to be serious enough to warrant a formal admission to the hospital.
Got it. So in these tragic situations, what kind of response can employers expect from OSHA?
Well, OSHA is very clear on this. Every fatality and catastrophe
Yeah.
will be thoroughly investigated. And these investigations, they aren't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. They're about understanding what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it from happening again.
So getting the full picture.
Exactly.
And I imagine those investigations can be pretty intense.
Oh, they can be very in-depth. They'll look at everything, from the victim's personal information and work history to the equipment and processes that were involved. They'll gather witness statements, review the company's safety and health program, and just analyze every detail to try to uncover the root cause.
Wow. Sounds incredibly thorough.
It has to be, especially because these cases can sometimes involve criminal penalties.
Whoa, hold on. Criminal penalties. You're saying an employer could face criminal charges because of a workplace fatality or catastrophe?
Yeah, in certain circumstances they can. The manual actually points out that Section 17E of the OSH Act allows for criminal charges against employers who willfully violate an OSHA standard rule or order, and that violation leads to an employee's death.
Okay, so we're not just talking about fines or citations here. We're talking about potential jail time.
Right. It can be very serious.
Wow.
And even though that particular section doesn't apply to violations of the general duty clause, the manual does mention that other criminal laws might come into play.
Like what?
Like laws related to making false statements or obstructing justice.
So even if there's no clear-cut violation of a specific OSHA standard, an employer could still be in trouble.
Right. If their actions or inactions contributed to a fatality or catastrophe.
Got it. And these aren't just empty threats either. OSHA actually will evaluate every single work-related fatality
They do.
to see if there was a willful violation of a standard.
Right.
And if they find evidence of that, it could lead to a criminal referral. So what are they looking for? What are some of those red flags?
Well, first of all, there have to be a fatality. Then they need evidence that an OSHA standard was violated and that that violation contributed to the death. But the key part here is there has to be reason to believe that the employer knew about the standard and chose to ignore it, or that they just demonstrated a blatant disregard for worker safety.
So it's not just about making a mistake. It's about knowingly putting employees at risk.
Right.
Okay. So if the regional administrator agrees with the area director that there may be a criminal violation,
Right.
what happens then?
Well, then they can involve the regional solicitor's office,
okay.
and this could mean bringing in a specialized team or even a criminal investigator.
So there's a whole process here, multiple levels of review to ensure a thorough and fair investigation.
Right, exactly.
This is heavy stuff, but I think it underscores how crucial it is for employers to make safety a top priority. Now, I wanted to shift gears a bit and touch on a sensitive but important aspect of these tragedies, supporting the families of the victims. Does the manual address how OSHA handles that?
It does. OSHA has specific procedures for communicating with the families of victims and keeping them informed throughout the entire investigation process.
That's good to hear. What do those procedures look like?
Well, first and foremost, family members will be contacted early on in the investigation to discuss the circumstances of the incident.
Okay.
So it's about offering support and information right from the start.
That makes sense. Families deserve to know what happened.
Absolutely. And beyond that initial contact, an information letter is sent to the family within 5 working days of identifying the victim. And the Assistant Secretary of Labor also sends a separate letter to the family expressing condolences.
Okay.
And OSHA will continue to communicate with the family throughout the investigation, keeping them updated on the progress.
It's about transparency and compassion, acknowledging that a life has been lost and that a family is grieving.
Exactly. It's about remembering that these investigations aren't just about legal proceedings or finding violations. They're about real people whose lives have been tragically impacted.
That's a really important point. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about imminent danger and the investigations that follow fatalities and catastrophes, and even the potential for criminal charges. But we've got one more area to explore, OSHA's approach to emergency response. So stick with us. We'll be diving into that right after this.
Okay, so we're back, and we're shifting gears a bit now to talk about emergency response and rescue operations. These are obviously high-pressure situations where every second counts, so understanding OSHA's role in all of this is crucial.
Absolutely. And the first thing to remember is that OSHA's primary focus, even in these emergency situations, is worker safety.
Okay.
They're not there to direct the rescue efforts themselves. That's the job of the first responders, firefighters, EMTs, other trained personnel.
So if they're not, calling the shots, what exactly are they doing during an emergency response? Well, they have two main roles. First, they're there to monitor and inspect the working conditions of anyone involved in the rescue operation. So even amidst the chaos of an emergency, OSHA wants to make sure workers are still being protected by the relevant safety standards.
So even in a life or death situation, OSHA is still concerned about compliance.
They are.
But I guess it makes sense, right? You don't want to put rescuers at unnecessary risk.
Exactly. Protecting the rescuers is paramount, and OSHA's second role is to provide technical assistance where needed. They have a lot of expertise in hazard identification, risk assessment, and control measures, and they can share that knowledge with the people on the ground who are actually coordinating the response.
So it's kind of a balancing act, right? They're there to enforce the rules, but also to offer support and guidance to make sure everything's being done as safely as possible.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, the manual specifically talks about a tricky situation that often comes up in these emergencies, what they call voluntary rescue operations by employees. So this is where an employee might see someone in danger and instinctively jump in to try to save them, even if it means putting themselves at risk.
Right, that human instinct to help.
Exactly. So what's OSHA's position on this? Like, could an employer actually get in trouble if their employee tries to be a hero?
Well, that's a great question, and the manual actually outlines some very specific conditions where an employer could be cited for an employee's voluntary rescue attempt.
Okay, so when would that happen? When would an employer be held responsible for an employee's good intentions, I guess?
Right. Well, there are three main scenarios. The first is if the employee was specifically designated or assigned by the employer to be responsible for rescue operations, but the employer failed to provide adequate training or rescue equipment.
So basically, you're putting someone in charge of rescues, but you're not giving them the tools and knowledge to do it safely.
Right, exactly. That makes sense. The second scenario is similar, but instead of being specifically designated for rescue, the employee is told by their supervisor or boss to perform those rescue activities as part of their regular job duties.
Okay.
Again, if the employer didn't provide proper training and equipment, they could be cited.
So the takeaway here is that anyone who might be involved in a rescue, whether it's their primary job or just something they might be asked to do, needs to be trained and equipped.
Absolutely. And the third scenario is a little bit trickier. This applies to workplaces where the potential for life-threatening events is foreseeable. So think of industries like construction, or hazardous waste handling, or emergency response itself.
Okay.
In those settings, an employee might see an imminent danger situation and try to do a rescue, even though they haven't been specifically assigned that role.
Right. It's that instinct kicking in again.
Exactly.
So is the employer off the hook?
Yeah.
Just because the employee acted voluntarily?
Well, not necessarily. The manual says that if the employer didn't adequately warn employees about the hazards of attempting a rescue without proper training and equipment, they could still get cited.
So it's about being proactive
and
discouraging those spur-of-the-moment rescues by untrained people.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the manual also emphasizes that if an employer has provided the proper training and instruction, they wouldn't be cited for an employee's voluntary rescue attempt, even if it wasn't successful.
So again, it comes back to training and communication.
Yeah, absolutely.
Making sure employees understand the risks and the procedures.
Right.
And those same principles apply to broader emergency response situations too. OSHA knows that they're just one part of a larger system, and they'll work with other agencies and authorities to make sure the response is coordinated and effective.
Right.
But they're always going to be advocating for the safety of the workers.
That's absolutely right.
So it's all about teamwork.
It is.
Everyone playing their part to handle these challenging situations.
You got it. And the manual even offers some specific guidance for OSHA's response to those really catastrophic events, the ones involving multiple fatalities, extensive injuries, or massive toxic exposures. They really stress the importance of a quick and decisive response with, again, worker safety as the top priority throughout every stage of the event, from the initial response to the cleanup and investigation.
So it's a long-term commitment, not just a short-term reaction.
Exactly. They're in it for the long haul.
Well, this has been a really informative deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from imminent danger to fatalities and catastrophes to emergency response. And I think the key takeaway for everyone listening is that these OSHA procedures, they're not just about checking boxes and following rules. We're about creating a culture of safety.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's about understanding that these situations are serious taking responsibility,
Right.
and always putting the well-being of your employees first.
Well-
So for all of you safety and risk management professionals out there, I want to leave you with this. How can you use this knowledge to make your workplaces even safer? What steps can you take to prevent these incidents from happening in the first place?
And if you're looking for additional support and resources, as you navigate these challenges, we encourage you to reach out to Safety One Source. We're here to help you create a safer work environment for everyone.
That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening, and stay safe out there.